So imagine one day you guys are in a rush to get somewhere important, wherever it may be, and distracted by the importance of your destination, you end up passing a red light. Suddenly, a police siren goes off, and you're pulled over by a police officer. The police officer orders you to put your hands behind your head, and because he suspects that you might be under the influence of alcohol. You refuse to put your hands over your head because you're confused and basically somewhat angered because you know that you have not consumed any type of alcohol. Suddenly, you and the officer find yourself in some type of disagreement where he's shouting at you, and you reach over to your glove compartment to be able to introduce your vehicle registration as well as your insurance. Suddenly, he pulls out his gun and shoots you. Just like that, a life is lost. And the reason being is so simple because the officer felt that his life was being threatened. The growing careless use of lethal force utilized by law enforcement should concern all Americans because one of these victims might one day be your friend or close relative. According to a fatal shooting database created by the Washington Post, in just 2016, 317 people have been killed by police. Out of that number, 84 victims were diagnosed with some type of mental disorder, and 21 had no weapon of any kind. The use of lethal force by law enforcement is a problem that Americans must fight to neutralize in order to make civilians feel protected once more. Today, I'd like to speak to you about a few of the issues that are associated with police brutality. I would like to introduce intervention policy that will help neutralize this controversial issue. And I would also like to speak about the benefits that would arise from introducing such a policy. Let's begin with my first point. Police brutality is a problem that we must tackle head on because of the many issues it has created in the United States. Minority civilians and Americans in general need reassurance that law enforcement is here to serve and protect rather than hurt. The problem is that victims of police brutality are not receiving the proper litigation when it comes to police brutality lawsuits and or trials. I have extensively researched the number of police brutality lawsuits that ended with officers being acquitted, and believe me, it is very difficult to find an exact estimate or just even a number that gives us an idea of how many police officers have been acquitted in such police brutality lawsuits. Unfortunately, for some reason, I had technical difficulties with my Keynote exporting my PowerPoint into Microsoft. So I'm just going to go ahead and name you some of the victims of police brutality that ended up dying by a police officer. So one of them was Yvette Smith. She was 47 years old and she was shot and killed by a police officer during a raid. She just answered the door. A police officer opened fire and immediately killed her. There's also Trayvon Martin, which I'm sure most of you guys have heard about since it was very controversial and it caused many riots as well. He was 17 years old and he was killed by a neighborhood police watch, George Zimmerman. There's also Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old. He was playing in a recreation center with his younger sister with a toy gun. A civilian just called the police, called it in, said didn't even say a little boy, just said there was a male, black male. And she thought that he was possibly shooting at people that were passing by. Police officer showed up without no warning, killed Tamir Rice. Also, Ayana Jones, 7 years old, killed in a house raid by a male police officer while she was sleeping. So the consequence of police officers being acquitted of any criminal charges in police brutality lawsuits has only enabled police officers to carelessly use lethal force anytime that they feel it's necessary, or just whenever they feel like it, basically. According to Erwin Chemerinsky, Dean of the School of Law at the University of California, Irvine, the Supreme Court has made it very difficult to hold police officers and the governments that employ them accountable for civil rights violations, and therefore making it difficult to deter illegal police behavior. A secondary problem associated with police brutality is that it has caused tension between law enforcement and minority civilians. With mainstream media constantly showing minority civilians as victims of police brutality, minorities are beginning to feel targeted. Peter Moskos, a professor in the Department of Law and Police Science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, agrees that minorities are mostly targeted by police officers due to the high concentration of crime
crime rates in impoverished communities. If our justice system continues to fail in holding police officers accountable for their crimes, the United States might begin to suffer the consequences of national protests demanding justice for its minority civilians that have been victims of police brutality. Our nation might soon be on the verge of facing again violent riots such as those of 1992 following the verdict of the officers in the beating of Rodney King. Now that we have briefly explored a few of the problems associated with police brutality, I would like to present you with an intervention policy that might help neutralize this controversial issue. In order to neutralize police brutality and help civilians feel protected, we must implement a complete police reform as well that not only extensively retrains officers, but holds them accountable for the unjustifiable use of excessive force. A complete police reform is needed to retrain officers to make better judgment calls when faced with hostile or unclear situations during arrest. If we wish to attract the attention of our nation to such a controversial issue, then we must start so by sending letters to our senators, sending a letter to our president, as well as to our mayors to speak on such controversial issue. According to the White House, President Barack Obama has proposed a 3-year, $263 million package aimed at law enforcement reform. This includes the increased use of body cameras, retraining officers, extensively retraining officers, and more resources of police department reform. Although $263 million is a lot of money, the cost will be worth the benefits because the United States will face less police brutality lawsuits in which the state sued had to settle out of court due to wrongful deaths. Secondly, the newly introduced police reform should include mandatory personal accountability forms that must be signed by police officers in the case that they unjustifiably use excessive force. Most police officers might not like signing such a form. A mandatory personal accountability form will likely make police officers feel uneasy doing their jobs because then they will know that they will not be protected by the respective agency that employed them. Some law enforcement officers might want to quit their jobs when presented with such a form, but in the long run, we will have more law enforcement officers that take their job serious and make better judgment calls during arrest. So how exactly will the United States benefit from complete police reform? With the introduction of a complete police reform to solve police brutality, Americans will begin to feel safe again. This, of course, will be even more true if police officers would be held accountable for their actions. Tension between law enforcement and minority civilians will be reduced. The United States will hear of less threats made to police officers, such as those executed and made by Ismail Brinsley on December 2014, when he killed and shot two NYPD officers' execution styles right after the murder of Eric Garner, who was killed by an illegal chokehold banned by police protocol. Americans will hear less of police brutality protests that are associated with police officer acquittals. Once police officers are held accountable, Americans will feel that justice has been served. Police officers will be properly trained to critically assess a situation and use the best strategy to de-escalate it before using lethal force. The percentage of police brutality cases will drop throughout the United States, and our states will also avoid pricey settlements with families of victims of police brutality due to wrongful death. In conclusion, I hope that I have provided you with enough information on how police brutality has become a controversial in the United States, the policy that we must use in order to neutralize this controversial issue, and as well as the benefits that would arise from introducing such a policy. The use of lethal force by law enforcement is a problem that Americans must aim to put a stop to if we want civilians to feel protected once more. If you feel that police brutality is a controversial issue, then I ask you guys to send a letter to your state senator and ask them to please tackle this controversial issue that is affecting America widely. The next time you see an innocent victim of police brutality in the news, just think, what if that person was your brother, your sister, or any relative? Because we never know how large an issue really is when it suddenly hits close to home.